Hi, everybody. Welcome to the August Scarlet Quill Society meeting here at Yeah Right. Um, I don't know. Sometimes I try to wait and weave this in, but I'm just going to YouTube it. Like, subscribe, hit the bell button, and if you like what you hear today, leave us a tip. It helps keep the lights on. We like that. You like that. Our panelists like that. Um, I do want to open, as usual, with our land acknowledgement, and we are a virtual company effectively, but our greatest nexus of connection with the land is on the traditional and current home of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Kathlamet, Clackamas, the bands of Chinook, the Tualatin, Calaplia, and the Molalla peoples. We're in a confluence of rivers. We're in the shadow of the mountain, which should be known again as East, and that's where we sit. And as part of our duty to that land, Yeah Right donates to NAYA, the NAYA Family Center, which provides culturally specific programs and services that guide people in the direction of personal success and balance through cultural empowerment. And we do encourage you to look up where you're living and do something similar if you have the means to do that. And I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves and give their own land acknowledgements if they'd like before we dive into this month's topic, which is tropes you don't know you're using. Let's start with TC.
Sure. One thing I am sort of calling in, videoing in from Oakland, California. This is Alone Land. And one thing I wanted to be a little bit granular with my sort of like knowledge building for the audience, which is buy native wild rice, because it's not just about the commodity itself. There's a lot of work being done around decolonizing wild rice. There's a lot of native folks who are doing a lot of activism, particularly in Leech Lake in Minnesota, that are actually uh, actively protesting sort of the U.S. Park Service to actually grow wild rice on U.S. park land that has been historically native land of the Leech Ojibwe tribe, and so they have been actually, they've gotten waiver after waiver, and they're like doing a lot of work to say we shouldn't be getting waivers as if this is some kind of like boon that Park Service is giving to us. This is something that should be baked into a formal agreement that we have, because this was our land that we had been doing this, and wild rice is a native foodway. It's a native plant. It is native to northern Minnesota. And so they're not disrupting an ecosystem. They're actually reestablishing an ecosystem. So, and this is emblematic of a lot of native folks who are growing wild rice, is they see that not just as a sort of like commodity.
Right.
They see it as land reclamation. I'd also name sort of another group, Native Hawaiians reclaiming land for food. One of the most amazing ones is Ma'o Farms, which is a Native Hawaiian sort of owned cooperative farm that is growing native Hawaiian crops. They're doing a lot of taro planting in particular, but they're also doing native sort of fisheries as well. So I just wanted to be kind of give a clearer, like, or more granular sort of way people can sort of be in allyship and support native sovereignty, and specifically wild rice. Look for wild rice that is native owned and grown, because you are not actually just buying some rice, you're actually supporting a movement and a revolution to decolonize food.
I really appreciate how much new knowledge you bring every time I hear you do a land acknowledgement. Um, thank you so much. It's a really good reminder to us as well that we can be doing things like that. Kat, I know you have a.
So I had for many years been doing a land acknowledgement sort of vaguely around where I was geographically, and I've done one around where I grew up and where I was born. Recently, because of security issues, I've been giving a very generalized land acknowledgement. And at this point, I want to talk about the fact that I am not a refugee or a child of refugees, but we are, all of us globally, going to be increasingly surrounded by refugees and children of refugees, and that land acknowledgements for people who've been forcibly uprooted by large things beyond their own personal choice. Land acknowledgements are a source of pain and revisiting revisiting their past, and that as these things happen, it is important for us to remember why people move and the many reasons that people move, and to highlight the fact that Indigenous people all over the world are being moved, and also that um, there are many, many Indigenous groups in the U.S. who say we welcome refugees because they're not settlers, they're not colonists, they are invited guests of our land to come find a place to live and have community. And that as we talk today, we're going to talk about the ways that community is the bedrock of all these things. And that when we say that we are living on native land, one of the things that often we separate ourselves from is that we talk about the land having been traditionally or whatever, but we don't talk about where these people are living now. We don't talk about how they're living. We don't talk about how we are living and whether or not we are living in community, and the ways that we do and don't know the environment that we're in. So I am using my opportunity right now to talk about the distinction between hundreds of years of having had the opportunity to live in the same place, the violence of not having had that opportunity, and the sort of freedom or marginalization that moving from one place to another involves, and to encourage people to see what you, as TC said, what you can do around you to just incorporate that so that it is not this thing that is a little ritual to be any other thing that you're going to do that's your actual daily life. That some of the repair, land back, means all sorts of complicated things. You'll hear many, many different explanations of what's wanted. But acknowledging displacement as the world gets increasingly more volatile is going to be really important.
Thank you. Folks, if you want to know a little bit more about each of our speakers, again, link is in the description. Head over to our post, check out their bios. We've got also links to, I think, Kat's socials and Patreon, where she hosts discussions of social justice and this type of thing literally every day, all day long, which is a little ridiculous. We'd like her to sleep once in a while, but we appreciate that she does it. So I do want to jump in with not a question, but a comment at the beginning to kick this panel off. Before we started recording, we were talking about a lot of the sort of underlying principles for this month's topic, one of which is when you make assumptions about what people do, you've created this category of people who don't do that aren't people. And that is, I think, near and dear to everyone's heart on this topic, both in TC's everyday policy work, in Kat's work. But I want to talk about not just people and what people do, but we were talking about one of the, and I'm gonna take shameless advantage of the fact that my poor boss is on mute and ask her to find the link to this Tumblr story that we were talking about, which is I don't want to give too many spoilers, but it is an apocalyptic daycare story. And it is told from the point of view of a daycare worker who is the last person at the daycare after all her coworkers go home, and there are kids whose parents have not picked them up yet. And it's a really, really, really effective story, not just on a... If you want to know how to assemble every single trope into a story, this story is nothing but tropes. I just want to front that right now. It is nothing but tropes. When you get done with it, you'll be like, this is this, and here's 12 examples of that, and this is this, and here's 12 examples of that. But at the same time, it's also incredibly effective because it never shakes you out of its environment. It never takes you out of that. There's no point at which you're like, this doesn't fit into that trope. So Kat said something about the person who wrote this clearly has, and I don't think any of us knows this author personally, to the best of my knowledge. We might. It's Tumblr. It's pretty anonymous when it's not making up, movies that didn't happen. I love you, Tumblr. But this person clearly has basic knowledge about every single thing that they've put in, including the fantasy aspects that they can't possibly have knowledge about. So how do you extrapolate to that without just projecting yourself onto it? What's the advantage here?
I don't think that the author hasn't projected themselves onto this story. I think that the author is very, very clear that, all right, we are all speculating because we don't know who the author is. But if this author has not had firsthand experience being a daycare provider, the traditional thing these days, I think, is to eat a sock. I don't like socks in general, so I'm not going to eat one either. We could go off on a tangent. I'm not going to. But it is vividly very, very real in a way that friend of Yeah Right, Jed Hartman, talks about author points, where there's a certain amount of slack that a reader might give to an author for infelicities of voice, of framing, of description, of anything. And this Tumblr writer has managed to just, to use an American sports metaphor, hit it out of the park, because it's sailed through every possible stumbling block. It's just out stratospherically in orbit. It's amazing. And
there were a lot of chances for it to miss that, right?
I don't think it's because the author hasn't put themselves in the story. I think it's because the author's super aware of their viewpoint, and the author is part of the story because they are the voice of that narrator. They are that POV character that we're seeing this story from. And it's without giving spoilers, it is a fresh corner of how we do this. And it is a thing that we've come to expect to find on Tumblr, because Tumblr, being a very peer-to-peer medium, allows all sorts of things to flourish. But the stories that end up having the most lasting traction on Tumblr are the ones that really do hit many, many of us as being very real, because the author is often in fantastic environments, often in fanficky ways, telling stories that really bring us into that world and don't throw us out of it until it's done. And I think that's the thing that we're all trying to do and not always remembering to try for.
TC, what did you want to?
Yeah, I have a question, because I'm just looking at the Tumblr post, and it's a prompt. And what I wonder about, because I am not in fiction writing, I'm in philanthropy, and one of the things I'm trying to do more and more as somebody who's in philanthropy is show my work. I think one of the biggest impacts I make is not the conclusions I come to or the recommendations I make, but how I came to those conclusions, who I consulted, and what lens I was looking at.
I know I've seen a not cropped version. We'll find it.
Because what I'd love to see, and if this happens in fiction, because I am not in the fiction world, but I am pushing my colleagues, and my colleagues are pushing me for, is to ask those questions where now, like, we actually have in my organization an equity filter that says, what are the unintended consequences of, like, for example, this DEI policy we're creating? Who is it benefiting? Who is it going to be, impacting negatively? We ask those questions now to show our work. And I'm just wondering on this, are there ever any, like, rather than having it be a writing prompt, having it be a pre-writing prompt of, before you actually write the story, to go through and talk about what are the assumptions you're making about daycare? What are the, because I'm getting more and more fascinated, less about the final story and more about what the person was thinking when they were writing the final story.
Everybody go look at last year's Scarlet Quill series. We did a full year on editing, and this is one of the developmental editing questions that we talk about asking. What don't you know? What sensitivity readers might you need who have some gut level knowledge of the things you don't know? One of the, not to yank it back to Tumblr, but the other course correct writing prompt that I think that a lot of people are really familiar with is the grandma and the demon. And the grandma who is like knitting or crocheting or something and somehow manages to make a sigil and summon a demon. And that prompt was clearly written by somebody with absolutely no knowledge of either grandmas or the thing that the grandma was supposed to be doing. And then whoever picked the prompt up and ran with it figured out how to make that work. But that is definitely one of the processes. And it's something that we talk about doing as early in your story as possible. Mm-hmm. And I know when we had Kat, we had Asha, we had Shannon on. Did we have anybody else on the sensitivity reader panel?
No,
Kat?
That was the three of us.
Yeah.
But
that's
folks,
fascinating.
you can go back and watch that from last year, and we will talk about how to figure out what you don't know and who to ask about it.
Because that's the intersection of what we're talking about today, which is like DIY, handicrafts, fiction, created worlds based on what's seen as natural and pastoral versus what is seen as artificial. And what is fascinating about even that prompt is, could somebody doing I'm a quilter, could somebody doing DIY handicrafts accidentally create a sigil? I struggle with that, because when I make a quilt, I have to have a design and a pattern ahead of time so I can calculate how much fabric I have, what colors do I need to have, are they going to be complementary, how big is the quilt going to be? I have to do that before I ever sew anything. So I couldn't be, oopsie, I just summoned a demon.
That's about a particular style of
on a long arm thing, because you could freehand quilt a sigil accidentally on a frame.
No.
If you I know people who do it without sketching the pattern out.
Okay, because I
don't have
long arm. I have a frame, so yeah. I actually need to draw it out, because where am I going with it? Otherwise, there might be, for example, one of the things about quilting is you actually, when you're actual quilting, you have to like do a very intentional design, because there might be a way that you're smushing fabric together.
Okay. See, you don't. Crazy quilts literally exist, and you can do it in completely improvisational crazy quilt, and you could absolutely accidentally stumble into a sigil using a crazy quilt.
Okay.
If you're talking about
what we're talking about, what do quilters?
And also, even if you have, I am not a quilter, but I think I can. Please correct me when I'm wrong. But
I'm in the middle
if you have an established quilt pattern that you're using, and we could also talk about the legends of map embedding in quilt making, which is a big story. When Rowan and I were driving through, there's an actual rest stop in Iowa, is
Iowa.
it? That
Iowa has
talks
the
about the
best
underground.
rest stops. They all have a narrative arc to them.
So
Every single one of them is a micro museum. Y'all, stop at rest stops.
Iowa's underrated for that particular thing. So to go on, if you took an established quilt pattern, okay,
Mhm.
and you know what your blocks are, but
Yeah.
you could, for instance, accidentally, because of your color pattern and pattern choices, create a rhythm within your quilt
Mhm.
that inadvertently evokes a thing that is a, a subtext, right,
Mhm.
of the pattern where the overt outline pattern is this established thing, right? But that
Think about all the
the way you
variations of like
pieced it
Lone Star.
together,
And
right,
then
turns
is
into
it like this, or is it all this? Or do you have a
so
red
it's
block in every place that you would need to make a demonic sigil? Sorry, Kat.
so I think that this is a plausible kind of thing that to happen. And I also think that there is a difference between being a very meticulous, pre-planned,
Mhm.
methodical quilter and being somebody who is much more loosey-goosey, because I've seen an entire range of
Mhm.
people approaching quilts. And also I've heard people going, oh no, a quilt, a quilt pattern is a thing where like everybody's going to produce the same quilt. And I'm like, that's literally
No.
not true.
Yeah.
Every choice that can be made is creating something different, even if you have the general gist of what's going on, which is basically, I think you could say a quilt pattern is a trope, right? Then what you
Yeah.
do with it is how that's unfolded in your own hands.
And I
And
think
this is
this is a really good example. I mean, I think again, what are the I have a certain trope that comes from my lived experience of quilting that may not be everybody's, and I think
right.
this is where I would really love to sort of see more, and maybe what I'm hungry for is less fiction and more
So,
process.
but let me talk about process in fiction right now, because we
Yeah.
have assumptions about, so many of us have assumptions about what does it mean to have a piece of fiction.
Hmm.
And there's an entire world of non-gate-kept fiction, also including traditionally gate-kept fiction, which includes the process discussion in the story. For instance, anthologies very often have framing discussion before the story, both in the way that the anthologist collected the stories and what they were looking to gather, and also often in notes about what the particular author had drawn upon to write that story. And then you also have, when you have themed anthologies, you have a whole, we're going to look at 12 different, 24 different explorations of this theme, right? Which is effectively a kind of process exploration. And then also fanfic is possibly notorious for this kind of thing, where there are author notes and prefaces and excerpts that explain what the author was trying to do. And especially in the
Well, especially
context
on
of transformative works, people are taking, these are the things we know in the canon. This is where I'm departing from the canon. I had a plot bunny, which is one of the terms used for, I wanted to explore this thing. And then often, for instance, at AO3, there will be discussions from the commenters, and often it's just, oh, I really love this. And sometimes other people are looking at that going, I don't know why you do, but and there's etiquette around that, but also there is,
Hmm.
hey, did you know that this thing that you assumed is actually like this other thing? So there can be a collective community process for the storytelling, which is that show your work process that you're saying you're craving. It's less common in prepackaged commercial materials because there is the illusion of this is just how it's done. I've recently on YouTube been looking at a lot of meta discussion about the music industry. So there's a lot of discussion happening around how does this happen? Why does this happen? What is the process of bringing music to the masses? What is the economic process and all these other things? But uh, many, many, many people are craving process
Hmm.
and not just the commodity. And
some of it's a function of time, though, right? Like
yeah,
on AO3, or I'm sure there are people still on FF.net, um, or Tumblr, or any sort of ongoing media project site. you're getting these micro releases that you can then respond to. And it's not actually uncommon for the author to say, hey, somebody pointed out that I made this fundamental mistake in how XYZ works in the previous chapter. So there are edits there. You might want to go back and reread that because it flows into this one. But I want to circle back to the topic that we're dancing around the edges of. And I knew that this is just going to be a rabbit hole month, folks. Enjoy it. Which is, how do you figure out what you don't know? And one of the ways that you figure out what you don't know is that you need to be in community and you need to be in these discussions. We just had, in the last 5 minutes here, we're in community, we all do this thing, but how do you know that? The example I used in this month's post is Batman's kids go to Walmart. And all three of us had the same reaction to that, but the author didn't. The author, it never questioned that where you would go if you wanted to have a pool party is Walmart. So how do you personally, how do you recommend, what's the question that you ask yourself to figure out if you need to be re-examining? Or is it just, hey, re-examine everything, and it's not enough to just have your friends who have similar experiences to you as beta readers?
I mean, who is your beta reader for Batman's kids go to Walmart? I mean, this becomes difficult, right? Because people tend to stratify in class demarcated clusters, even if you're geographically dispersed, because we don't have a lot of guidance for people socializing and mingling across class strata.
Especially in the US, where we struggle to admit that class strata exist. 2 seconds.
Well,
author, if you find this, I liked your story. I'm just saying Batman's kids don't go to Walmart, but I liked your story. Thank you.
Sorry, I have not read this story because I don't read superhero fanfic. Sorry, author, but clearly it left an impact or we wouldn't be discussing this. I mean, on one hand, okay, I'm going to create a different fic in the same world, okay?
Fantastic.
Because I like the idea of
I feel like Superman goes to Walmart, though, right?
No, yeah, but also I like the idea, especially when he's at home with his parents.
Right?
I like the idea of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's kids go to Walmart for a pool party as a story. Because I'm not sure they've ever been to Walmart, but I feel like they've read this author's Batman fic and they've decided to throw themselves a pool party and forget all the toys that their parents supplied. They need to do this whole thing. And I like the idea of them going to Walmart and possibly encountering Walmart as a wild and mysterious place. There's it's now a very ancient book called Motel of the Mysteries, which was one of the very first explorations of what it looks like if you take mundane things or that I ever saw anyway. And it was a spoof on the Tutankhamun Museum tour of the 70s, but it's an archaeological exploration of an American motel with all sorts of explanations for what all these things must mean, and it must be a religious ritual and
a ritual
objects. And so it can be interesting to do the exercise of, let me take something that's very mundane in my world and what would it look like from the outside. And I see people in racial justice terms trying to do the discrimiflip of, we're so tired of having our foodways exoticize. What happens if we exoticize the things that are allegedly normalized? And they are of varying degrees of, I don't know what adjective to use. Some of them work for me better than others. Some of that is personal taste. And I keep encountering
I tend to call them like successful versus unsuccessful at landing that humor.
And again, I think that is partly subjective and partly I don't know, empirical observed something. But I have been arguing recently about the idea that there isn't actually a global metric for this is tasty and this is not tasty, and that this is flavorless and this is flavorful. Because I have had some vociferous extended discussions about whether or not you must season everything or whether it's okay to let the flavor of something shine through. This is an aesthetic judgment. This is a cultural judgment. And when we are writing our fiction or our nonfiction, it is important to think about who that reader is and what their expectations are, and who you are othering and who you are centering. And that it is really difficult to marginalize the people who are centered by default. There is no actual redress in discriminaflip that really changes the frame entirely.
Yeah. I want to circle to something that you did just say, though, because I want to talk about food. One of the big touchstones for how you can tell if an author is familiar with or immersed in a culture is how they talk about food in general, specific dishes, and for dominant culture people writing for other dominant culture people, there's a problem where the dominant culture perception of minority foodways reads as more authentic to other dominant culture members, or has been said to, depending on who the reader is. So I want to talk about that.
Can you expand on what you just said in a more concrete way, please? Because I'm not sure I followed you. About more authentic.
Okay, so I think we've both seen this 400 times on social media where someone says, I'm trying to think of like a really concrete example, and one of the concrete examples is just the sriracha problem, where it's, oh, this is the definitive spice, and it's on everything, and it's in everything. Or you'll recognize this one. It's not Thai food if it doesn't have peanut butter on it. I mean, and the perception of this is what an Asian salad is, like the whole concept of Asian salad.
See, I'm still stuck on is why do we act like sriracha is superior to ketchup?
I think it's more delicious, but I also like ketchup, so.
Which is more delicious than which?
I like sweet hot flavors, and sriracha tends to land more there for me, so I like sweet hot mustard. I like barbecue sauce more than ketchup. It's not objectively better, I don't think. I prefer it.
I mean,
there might be some time to tell you about the burger I had last night.
I mean, I think part of it, like for fiction for me, is I think for me, it's within the story, show your work also, might be, like it might be like process-wise layers of like, number one, in the writing prompt or in the exercise, have a step that is show your work, of like, just be explicit about whose lens are you looking for, whose eyes are you looking through, whose like, experience is this character is having, what assumptions are you making, and then go from there. Because I think one of the examples I'd really love to give as a show your work moment, is like, in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, all the way back in the 80s, they actually had an episode that explained why the super team in a New York brownstone in Queens had a giant supercomputer bat cave set up. And they actually explained it. They said they did a solid for Tony Stark and he set it up for them. And they showed how they put furniture on top of it. They showed how they built, and so like, I think for me, I was like, that just made Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends so much more entertaining, because I was wondering, why do 3 students at Empire State University have access to money to like build a bat cave, essentially, is the best way I can describe it. And
Yeah, it
they
really
like
is. It was
it.
like the
And I was
whole
like, oh my
living room
God,
would
they
flip
did Tony
over.
Stark a solid. And we know
I
Anthony has lived in that brownstone for ages. So nobody's like doing like, sort of compliance checks on that building, So
I
it's
I
it makes sense.
Hey, fanfic authors out there, I would like to see the Friends or other New York implausible three young things live in a giant apartment sitcom setup explained just like this, because I think that would be a hilarious thing to read. So this is my ask
Right, it's
from
totally plausible. If you
just like
inherit this rent-controlled apartment or something, but you can't just show up there.
so the other thing that I want to say about this is, first of all, TC, if you haven't read Neil Stephenson, you should.
Yes.
Because frankly, the way Neil Stephenson writes, also Cory Doctorow, and I really love these authors, by the way, is all about explaining how you get to this, as explaining, and there's a whole lot, and a lot of people like to skip these parts or hate this kind of writing because there's a lot of explanation of
It's
the world
super dense.
building and this is the context and this is the, and you can just rabbit hole the whole thing. Anne Leckie in her world building does a whole lot of this is how this entire empire unfolded.
Mhm.
There is work out there that does this. It's one of the reasons I love science fiction because it is acknowledged that it's a kind of speculation that there is a huge demand to explain.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I tend to go the other way and expect the reader to know the tropes and to just play with the tropes,
Mhm.
which is a different way of doing this. As a developmental editor, there's a big range between what are you trying to do in this story? Are you actually trying to have a story about how you came to these conclusions, or are you trying to tell a story within a shared framework that everybody knows? Or that you're asking the reader to do the work to figure out? For instance, I think in policy work, it is important to spell out things and to be explicit. In the work that I'm doing, um, facilitating conversations about social justice, I do a lot of do your own work because doing that work and not getting spoon fed is a really, really important part of people learning to do it themselves,
Mhm.
which gets back into that discussion we were having earlier about whether or not um, charitable or whatever other framing for this work is focused on individuals or communities or systems, because that's also a question of how your fiction is functioning. Is this an individual knowledge? Is this a community knowledge? Is this a allegedly generalized knowledge? And if it is allegedly generalized, let's talk about how that came to be, because I think that I'm finding that we really, as a global community of individuals and places, need to think about how do we know this information? Is this propaganda with a purpose that's obfuscating reality? Is this actually unavoidable acknowledgement of reality? All of these things, so that we look through what was the goal of the person who told me this thing? What was the goal of the person who told that person this thing, right? How far up the chain do we go to get to what was being said? And one of the things that's been really interesting is that I have a lot of international conversations every day now because thank you, internet, and thank you, my own social network. But the things that are assumed are very, very different for what's normal. I am a North American living in the US, mostly in places that have terrible public transit. And so I don't expect that the posted timetable schedule is when something's going to show up. And when there's a bus schedule, I've lived in places where it says that it will be there at 10:10, and that means it will be there's sometime between 9:50 and 10:30 unless it's skipped. And we accept this as normal in the kind of context I live in. I have a friend who lives in a context where he knows absolutely that if he gets to the bus stop within 90 seconds of when it's posted, he can just step on the bus. And so he optimizes his time for, yep, gonna do this and this and this and the bip, gonna look up and like the amount of slack time he puts into his schedule for will the bus be there or not is it's science fiction to me. It's fantasy and magic. And yet my parents come from a context where if the train is late, there's a public apology and from Japanese transit. This is a globally famous or infamous trope, and it mostly is true. So what you locally assume is it serves a whole bunch of people for a whole bunch of reasons.
So we're back to what TC was talking about earlier too, with DEI work and with doing this pre-examination. And one of the questions that it's sounding like everybody's talking about, like we've talked sort of around the edges of this, is you have to start with the question, who am I? You have to start with that. You have to know who you are, at least to an extent. What is my context? What am I bringing to this? If you're, there are carve outs. Kat's already got three. Three? Only two? So, but to know what you are likely to be bringing to things, know who you are and what your context is, and then you can sort of examine. One of the ways that you can do this is sort of examine the people in your story and the situations in your story and say, is this the most likely, or is this coming from my experience? Is my experience relevant to this, or is there a more relevant experience that I should be looking for? Kat, carve this up.
So for me, in my perspective, and from my years of coaching people and also the conversations I've been having with creators and editors, that is really good advice for somebody who lives in the relatively unmarked state, by which I mean people who do not have demographic adjectives applied to them consistently. And I hear the cis women watching this going, well, yeah, I know what I am. Hold on a second. Because for many Black, Indigenous, POC living in the US, while we have had adjectives assigned to us, we've also, until recent decades, not been given templates so that we know how to put ourselves into the story, so that many Black, Indigenous, and POC writers I talk about the fact that their first stories were about writing a story of whiteness, because we are encouraged to find ourselves in those stories, and also to tell those stories rather than our own stories in our own context. And it's not about not knowing who we are, it's about our perception of what will be allowed and what will be accepted and what we have to explain. And so it's also useful for everybody to think about what has to be explained, what doesn't have to be explained, how should it be explained, and how much should it be explained. Because for compact storytelling, or even in epic long saga length storytelling, what are you actually talking about? What are you telling? What are you not telling? It's not just about awareness of identity, but it is also about what are you hoping to explain and convey. Because for many authors of color, there's a desire not to be pigeonholed into being, oh, that's a Black author, that's a queer author, that's a this or that. And there's often a pressure to choose one marginalization, for instance. And also if you are a Black wheelchair using lesbian, do you only have to write about Black wheelchair using lesbians? And so there's a lot of political, in the sense that everything is political, choice being made in that. And that I'm going to say for the people watching this, that this advice is especially crucial to the people who live in the unmarked state or relatively unmarked state. For instance, and I know that somebody watching this at some point is going to be white, trans, a woman, disabled, and this person may be saying, well, I'm multiply marginalized, I know, and I'm writing the story from that place. All of us, all of our privileges, whether it's class privileges or educational privileges or language privileges, have places that we're not really looking quite as hard as we could be at what are we conveying and what political power does that carry that we normalize this thing. Because even if we are not directly benefiting from that systemic power, we are aiding that systemic power or that effort toward liberation based on how we're framing this.
And I think the other thing I would want to say related to sort of social change is also not just where we get our information, but how we get our information, because that also creates narratives of centering who's getting centered and who is seen as a neutral observer. And the thing I want to shut down, if I could wave a fairy wand and just eliminate something, which is all of these, like, I walked a day in somebody else's shoes and now I have come to this magic, thing. Cory Booker spent a month on food stamps and he was like, God, it's really hard, and I'm like, no duh. I mean, like, it's one of those things where the how of how you get that information is really important, because in those exercises, you have still centered yourself, and you've still put yourself as the authority on what it's like to be poor, that you're now telling everybody about. And I think that really, that actually goes back to the food conversation about what's tasty, what's not tasty, things like that, because that assumes there is one neutral observer that can name what is taste. There is one neutral observer, because, like, I've eaten Michelin-star restaurants that have been divine, and I also like a Big Mac, and part of me liking a Big Mac is that, like, I ate Vietnamese food every single day, twice a day, except when I ate lunch. And so lunch was like this exotic thing for me, because, oh my God, there's tuna casserole and I've never had tuna casserole, So I think, again, it is one of those things where it's like, it's also how you get your information, because if you're getting the information in a way that centers yourself and assumes that you are a neutral observer that's discovering information, and that's also something in fiction, the stranger in a strange land trope of, like, they actually, in that story, the stranger is not written by the author as strange.
Right.
It's the strange land that's seen as strange, and the strange land inhabitants see the point of view character as strange, but the author themselves don't see the point of view character as strange. They've never really put themselves from the viewpoint of the inhabitants of the strange land. And I think that's the one where, again, whose perspective is being centered, even as you get information. If you are getting information, and again, one of the reasons that, I want everybody to have awareness, but usually awareness is on the backs of marginalized people, and it usually doesn't do anything. I mean, when we think about awareness about racism, when we think about awareness about poverty, and all of these exercises that are about awareness as it's the end all be all, it usually doesn't lead to systemic change. It leads to some really great fundraising, but that isn't systemic change.
So, sorry, I thought a horn beeping outside and it's completely derailed my thought. The thing about who do you learn it from is that everybody loves to say travel is broadening. You become less this or that or the other if you travel. And I have, at this point in my life, hundreds of examples of traveled and didn't learn, or traveled and reinforced a thought, right? Because
it's so possible to travel in a bubble.
And then they'll say, oh, but if you live in a place, and I'm like, have you seen the people who call themselves expats? Have you seen what the colonizers live like when they're in, other contexts? have you seen what people who have been doing business transfer living do when they are, an exec of company A in country B? So a lot of these people bring a bubble with them. And as a reader, as a writer, you can bring that bubble with you. And also to be aware of the fact that, for instance, for me, I learned about what is life like for white people by reading fiction, and I had a whole lot of it to read. But when my friends try to learn what is it like to be me, the corpus that they have access to is necessarily much smaller, and it's been gatekept, and it hasn't necessarily been gatekept by people with an intention of decentering or recentering various things, right? There is often an exoticized thing, and I want to talk again about the fact that exotic means you ain't from around here, are you?
Mm-hmm.
That's all that exotic means. It does not inherently mean oriental, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way it's used often. And that what is food supposed to be? And when I go look at communities talking about food, there's an assumption that everybody wants flavor, and that if you don't add flavor, but if you look at other sorts of communities talking about how to food, they're using other metrics. For instance, texture. A lot of food communities don't talk about texture. There are communities that only talk about texture. These things can be really drastically different. And I think there's also a space for food is only sustenance, food is sensuality, food is love. There's lots of different ways to do this. And, if you have, for instance, an alien species that you sort of mapped off of plants, do they think about food the same way? Or is food just a thing that happens in the way that humans often just take air as a thing that happens? When is the last time you read fiction that talked about the quality of air? I can name a bunch because I love looking for it, but for the most part, we don't talk about breathing. We just assume you can breathe.
And, it's really interesting because I've been reading, I love Heartstopper. I love the comic series and I love the series. And part of it for me is that, like, this is just to give Alice Oseman her flowers because, she had a bigger canvas to paint on with the Heartstopper series. And she took marginal characters in terms of didn't spend much time with them in the comics and centered them. And those were characters who were predominantly trans, BIPOC, things like that, when the comic series centered on two cis white men, So I think, like, what was really fascinating to me was how existing narratives rewired my brain around what I saw as usual versus what I saw as, and they use this as a compliment, but it's not the compliment people think it is. They kept on saying Heartstopper, the series, the reviews were like, it's idealized. It's idealized. And I
It is
they were
very
talking about,
idealized.
and it's weird though. For me, all of that talk erased my experience because I'm like, people were talking about, well, parents can't be that supportive. And I'm like,
Oh, well,
I'm 5 years older than the parents in that space. And, like, me and
that,
my cohort are
At
aspiring
least
to be
trying
supportive
to.
of
Yeah.
our queer kids.
that's not the one that I'm angry about in the idealization of Heartstopper and the way that it makes liberals feel good. I can't watch that series anymore. I cried really angry tears while my friends were feeling very, very seen and affirmed in that series.
Mhm.
And the characterization, this is from season one. I have not watched the new season, and I hope that we can say that this is not really a huge spoiler at this point.
Mhm.
Also, because I don't remember specific character names right now. It's been a while since I've watched it. Um, there was a black lesbian character who is portrayed as being completely oblivious about what it would mean to come out and was blindsided by the blowback to coming out. And I was infuriated by this character and really, really angry. And I said to my friend who'd introduced Heartstopper to me, "Oh, it's so feel good and it's so awesome," and like, and they didn't feel like it needed content warnings. And I said, "Is this author white?" Because I cannot imagine, even right now in 2023, a young black girl not knowing that coming out as a lesbian was going to be fraught, and that her white girlfriend had to explain fraughtness of coming out to her. That just didn't ring true to me. It threw me out of the entire series because there are POC characters, and I love that there are POC characters, and I love that there's POC queerness because there's not enough of it. But there's no racism in the Heartstopper world. And the reason it makes me angry is that racism is systemic. Supportive parents is an individual decision that parents are making. So when you have supportive parents, that's affirming the fact that there are supportive parents. When you portray a thing that is systemically a problem without flagging that this is an AU, and you erase the problem, it reminds me of being that suburban child in the early days of integration being told, "Oh, civil rights has happened and racism is over." And
This is
so for
also
me, Heartstopper
right.
was extremely traumatizing. I cried for hours after I watched it, not because my friends were sobbing because they felt affirmed and alive, and I felt very erased and very, it affirmed every bit of the way that the work I'm doing right now is being called troublemaking and why are you doing this and there's no need for this anymore. And watching all of my various friends of various demographics, and I'm not saying it was all my white queer friends doing this, but everybody going, "Oh yeah, it's so awesome," and I'm like, this is the first time I've publicly spoken about my pain around that series because there was so much pushback, and I was told that I should not talk about this, that it was a harmful thing for me to be saying, and there was a collective effort at silencing around this. So I agree that there's amazing magic in that story.
Mhm.
But also this thing,
This I think touches on something that is a big trope in fiction that people are trying to write, um, where they create a facially diverse cast and they create a reason for this facially diverse cast to have come together, and they're all on an individual level good and interesting people, and they do things like be supportive parents, be great friends, everybody's queer, nothing hurts. um, and what they end up doing is they make, either through a sort of wish fulfillment or through being a person who is writing from no or a very limited experience of this kind of trauma, of racialized trauma, of queer trauma, they erase the previous trauma that these people would have existed in, and then erase essentially the people who are trying to heal from that trauma together in community by saying, well, if you were just in a place where nobody was being actively racist at you right now,
Mhm.
everything would be fine.
I've talked about the fact that the unity of racialized experience is because of the racialization,
Hmm.
and that racialized communities inherently are not monolithic,
Mhm.
but many of us experience a sameness of circumstance because it's created by systemic problems, so that you don't have to encounter the racist person for this to happen. It's just there are so many that the probability that you've had this encounter is, essentially absolute, and that in erasing that and creating the situation where the reality is that all the people who said to me all my life, "Oh, I don't even see you as,"
Mhm.
or "Oh, that's just superficial," or "It's not important. We all bleed the same." Um, there's a big difference, and it reminds me of the way that my Jewish friends object to the term Judeo-Christian or that the way many of my friends object to the ecumenical religious framework that makes it so that everybody's religion is the same, because the ethical constraints around different religions can be very, very different. The reproductive rights arguments right now, there are reproductive rights arguments that are specifically religiously based for why we should have reproductive freedoms, as opposed to the Christian assumption right now that's common in the West for religiosity means being vehemently on one particular side. And so that erasure, which is devoted to this DEI, means less about diversity and more about equity and inclusion, but the inclusion means that you're welcome to come to the table, but you have to have passed yourself through the keyhole that has shaved off all the things about you that don't fit. When the keyhole was made to fit a specific thing, it reminds me of the fashion constraints where people are encouraged to think of themselves as, oh, my legs are too short, my feet are too wide, I am not, certain shape enough. And the reality is that there are 8 billion of us, and there are so many different phenotypes that really, if we distributed things better, there are a lot of people who are very long-waisted and short-legged, and we can make fashions that make them look fabulous, not necessarily by creating an illusion that they're long-legged, but celebrating the way they actually look, right? We can do all of these things, but when we have celebrations of diversity, which are about what I call Barbie dipping, which is a phrase I've coined myself because I grew up in that era where POC Barbie was just tinted, but the mold was exactly the same, and her hair was, just tinted, and that's not actually a reality for humanity. That's a very Procrustean, dystopian vision of what we could be. I mean, everybody, all humans are, this tall. It's that systematic thing that the US government and other agencies created for the ideal individual. And then I should figure out where the reference is. There's a YouTube video talking about the fact that the fighter jet program forced the military to actually do more customization of the spaces, because trying to find soldiers who fit into that particular cockpit is less effective than let's adjust your seat up and down or back and forth, right?
And they actually found that there is no standard body, and that's why they changed it to be adjustable versus saying let's idealize one standard body and then just build around that. And I think that's where I'm coming from in terms of sort of like, maybe it's a more accurate expression I should make is what is seen as realistic and not realistic, because my circle of parents are, number one, span a diversity of race, gender, sexuality, things like that. And my son's circle of friends looks very much like Heartstopper. And what I have been triggered by in terms of the idealism critique is saying your lived experience in your life in Oakland is not real.
Right.
And when people keep on talking about the idealization that, like, oh my God, Elle is not the only trans person on Earth, and there are actual trans people who she's friends with who, because marginalized people find each other, and we don't just exist in spaces with
right. What's realistic?
Yeah, I think like that's for me, that's the thing, is what is seen as realistic, when in a way it's all fiction, once again, we talked about it last time, which is like
yestertime,
the last one, which is like, just because something is set in New York doesn't mean it's more realistic, considering it's just because it's set in New York in 2023 or in Friends in 1994 doesn't mean it's any more realistic than Star Trek, because it's like 4 white people who never encountered BIPOC BIPOC people who don't have any friends except for the 4 white people. All of that is fiction. So why are we saying some portrayals are idealized and unrealistic? Other portrayals are completely natural. And usually what is seen as natural centers whiteness, cisness, maleness, things like that.
Capitalism.
Capitalism.
Well, I'll throw that one out there. Where are we going to get the money to pay for universal health care?
I also want to talk about the fact that there is fiction that centers cis womanhood.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of it, and there's a claim that it doesn't exist, and that it is vast, huge swaths of the capitalist publishing system, entire genres.
Even if we don't touch the, a mighty girl and empowerment series that are created specifically as they push back to this and are trying to be diverse and inclusive, even if we don't touch that, how much money does the Disney princess industry make every year, guys?
I mean, romance novels, right? It's a big genre.
But
we call it chick lit, and it exists. So I want to talk about, the thing that you're saying about the centering of masculinity, you're not wrong, but that's about who gets to be the ultimate power.
Yeah.
But it's not just masculinity. The masculinity is within certain demographic confines versus, certain demographics get to be in power over everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing is, shout out right now to all of us who grew up as the one kid of color in a sea of whiteness from my generation of integration, because we do exist. Our stories got overtold because we got access to the white gatekeepers because they were our friends and our friends' parents. And that is specifically why our parents brought us into those environments. But I want to acknowledge that we didn't always get to talk about the pain of being that kid in ways that were meaningful as a demographic category, as opposed to specifically just about the racism we encountered. And the ways in which that made us liminal and also less able to access the community of support from, as opposed to those of us who are of similar demographic categories as us, who grew up enfolded within communities of diaspora, within enclaves, because lacking that, we all grew up in this cohort feeling, and having mostly a feeling of grew up isolated and detached and basically an internal immigrant of a secondary sort, does lead to a particular sort of trauma that hasn't been specified quite as much. So both of these things exist, right? Enclaves exist, communities all of color exist, lots of things happen, but also some of us are 6th generation Asian Americans. Mm-hmm. Some of us are urban indigenous.
Not to cut you off, I really don't want to cut you off, but we are running right up against time. And not to turn you into a trope, but this is one of the things we're talking about, folks. When you are writing a story, if you have a character that is the only character of color, you need to be looking for those stories, not stories in general about being a character of color, or your experience as a person of color isn't necessarily relevant to this character's experience. Your experience as a white person is going to be relevant in some ways to your character of color's experience and not in other ways. And you need to look for ways in which not just what you are or who you are, but the environment that you're in has shaped your assumptions about your characters that are in a different environment from that.
I want to reflect back to what TC said about Cory Booker's month being poor is not the same as actually living that. A lot of writers want to say, oh, one time I was on crutches, so I know what it means to be mobility disabled. No, you don't. Yeah. You know about the specific moments you had, but not a lifetime.
And he can tap out
not just Cory,
too.
though.
But yeah.
the fact that, oh, I know what it's like to have somebody mispronounce my name. It's not the same if you don't have all of the context. Oh, I have a friend who was an exchange student, so I know what it's like to for somebody to be the one person who. That exchange student doesn't have the same experience as the person who grew up within the culture and has no other culture to fall back on and it's being othered, or the person who's like generationally, or there's such multitude happening here that it's really important as you're telling these stories to go back to the start of why we have this panel, to think about the specificity of the setting that you're creating so that the thing that you're creating is actually true all the way through because you didn't just do an approximation.
And again, it goes back to, in that information gathering, are you centering yourself? You know, what I would love, I know we're low on time, so what I would love for people to go out with is, don't rely on your experience to experience others, you know, is what I would say. And like, also rely on the work of people who actually get to control that work. Because like, if you're relying on your conversations with other people are going to calibrate. I will calibrate what I say based on positional power, based on race, based on all of those things. So if you think you're getting the full straight dope from me because we had a really great conversation, you're not. But there are some amazing people who've decided to make YouTube videos, to write blogs, to write articles in ways that are truly in their own voice, and oftentimes they're compensated for it. They get ad revenue for it. And so what I would say is, and those people, when you're reading it, you have to center them, not you, you know. So I do think, you know, that's why sensitivity readers are so important, because they're doing a job. They're doing a job. And when you are relying on interaction and conversation for getting out of your own view, you are literally handcuffing your ability to really write a good character, because all of us are going to calibrate who we are and how we show up based on who's across the table from us.
I want to point that before Kat jumps in and say that, folks, I love the YouTube creator idea, but also do look at who's across the table, because if their money is coming from large corporations or from white people, essentially, or from people who are in systemic power, ultimately a lot of money does flow from people who are in systemic power, and be aware that they may still be making those videos for that gaze.
The Yeah Right panel that we did about sensitivity readers went into a lot of the detail that I'm just going to point to right now, because even when you hire a sensitivity reader, if you don't give them the space to say things and to be honest, you're not going to get everything you need. And also just be aware that people self-censor for safety reasons all the time.
And I think I just want to put a pin in this, because this is a broad conversation that requires an entire hour. But I would really love to talk about, what does it mean to offer up a safe space for somebody to be authentic in their sharing? And that is something I want to dig deeper on in another conversation, because it's so important.
Folks, give some thought to how you can do that in your daily life too. Like, what is safe, what is unsafe? Are you saying you're safe? It's got to be more than an office door sticker.
The other thing I want to talk about is, and the reason I'm writing the Etiquette for Social Justice, and I've been struggling with it, but you can find bits and pieces of it in the Facebook writing that I do, is that safe is not a single thing any more than taste is a single thing, and that what is perceived as violent or impolite or wrong or aggressive are all very relative, and it has to do with power dynamics and systems and all sorts of things. So when you are writing, whether it's your fiction or your nonfiction, the assumptions about how somebody feels, whether that's an appropriate behavior or not, what these things signify is not absolute. It has to be built into the logic of your story, and you have to understand the context from which you're building that, because that may be the thing that reveals that you have a cultural concept that you have dragged in and grafted onto a story or a character or a situation that you don't realize you've done, but is going to throw out the people who really know what's it from the inside as they're reading your story.
Thank you, Kat, for doing the wrap up so I didn't have to. Thank you, everybody, for joining us again. We will see you next month when I will hopefully be throwing fewer cats out of the dog's bed next to me. Everybody wanted in there this time. But TC, thank you as always. Kat, thank you as always.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And bye, everybody. See you September.